So my name is Nick Perlick. I'm an associate VP in the Philanthropic Council Division at BWF. So in the course of my career, spanning a little more than 2 decades, mostly in higher education, I came up a pretty traditional path with respect to being a gift officer, ultimately sort of culminating on the institutional side as a chief development officer. I was a vice president at one point at a comprehensive public university. Finished my institutional work, as it were, at least for now, at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville as an assistant vice chancellor, and then have been with the firm for the last 3 years and work with clients all over North America, primarily higher education, but about a third or a quarter of my work with other nonprofits. Spend a lot of time talking with folks about campaigns. So excited to be here today and have this chance to talk with you, Michelle, and to share some time with our colleagues.
Absolutely. Well, my name is Michelle Greene. I also serve as an associate vice president here at BWF on our Philanthropic Council. Before joining the BWF team, I spent my advancement career at the University of South Dakota, my alma mater, as I mentioned, where I served as the vice president of Philanthropy and Engagement, along with a variety of other roles, developing teams over the course of about 9 years.
And I'm glad that you're here with me today. So this is going to be fun.
Sounds great. Okay, our next slide is really just a few housekeeping things. Nick, if you want to hit the next one, there's not a ton of information here, but we do want to hear from you. This is intended to be helpful for you and your organization. Kind of get a peek behind the curtain at how do we set this and set ourselves up for the best amount of success. So please do drop your questions in the Q&A. Here's our plan. We're going to do our best to address them as they come in. If we start to get flooded with questions, we might park a few of those so that we can get through the content of the day, but we have a great plan in place to follow up with each of you alongside with our marketing team. So all questions will be answered at some point, whether or not that is in this hour or not, but do drop them in the Q&A because we can record those and get back to you with them after the fact as well. So keep them coming. Awesome. All right, if we want to head on to the next one, we'll start digging into, I'm a Midwest girl, the meat and potatoes of this presentation.
There you go.
So Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about that strategic value and then I'll jump into some of the key elements after that?
You know, this is really why we're here today, right? We're here to have about an hour-long conversation. What is the strategic value of campaign planning? However an organization goes about it. What are they really trying to accomplish? What can it reveal? How can it strengthen everything that you're trying to do? Some thoughts that I put together on this, you know, I think that it helps really ensure organizational alignment with the universities and the nonprofits that we work with. Sometimes we find that there's an ambition for a number, a dollar goal. There's an ambition simply to get about the next campaign. Maybe there's a little more strategic thought of we've got some needs, and so it's sort of time to do a campaign. But do we have organizational alignment from top to bottom about what we're trying to accomplish? And when we talk about alignment, does the board have a common view as the executive leadership, as does, in the case of a university, deans and department chairs? And then certainly the chief development officer and the advancement staff, right? So is there comprehensive organizational alignment about some of the things that we're going to be talking about today? What are the priorities? What are the needs? Why are we going about this, right? And then of course, how people are involved. So we're trying to really create that ownership and buy-in. But I want to emphasize here, you know, this isn't just about the on-campus audience. While we're trying to achieve that internal to the organization, we really start to think here about how we're engaging donors and volunteers, and we're going to talk about that too. If done well, the planning process can really bring some of those closest friends, dearest friends, highest level donors, bring them close to the organization during a time when plans are being explored for the campaign, and allow them to have a really substantial level of ownership once the institution decides to move forward in the campaign. You know, obviously, when we think about planning, if people were to distill it down to one component, my guess would be they would think about feasibility interviews, right? And there's a lot to the planning process that we're going to talk about. But I think if you were to poll people, what's the one thing you think about with respect to campaign planning? It probably relates to feasibility interviews. And that does remain a major component for most organizations of how they go about planning. And it reveals to us opportunities, ideas for how we can engage those donors, right? We're able to get feedback about what are their aspirations, hopes, and dreams philanthropically. How do their passions overlap with the organization's passions, right? How do they want to be involved? Ultimately, we spend time, you and I were talking about this earlier, Michelle. The term culture of philanthropy gets tossed around a lot, right? I would dare say it's not a throwaway comment. We've spent time talking with people about operational definitions of a culture of philanthropy. And in fact, the planning process, if done well, it really pressure tests for the organization. How are we performing? What's our current state with respect to any number of things that we're really going to get into today? And then something, we talk a lot about with organizations. How can the planning process and the campaign itself really help build permanent capacity? We're not just trying to achieve the most immediate dollar goal, but how can we elevate capacity permanently so that we create a new normal for philanthropy and really establish a new basis upon which future campaigns can be launched, right? If we create that new norm, then potentially higher amounts can be pursued in future campaigns. So these are some of the things that we're going to try to get into today.
And Nick, I think your comment about culture of philanthropy is such an important one. And with some of the institutions and organizations and teams that we work with, we hear a variety of things of what that means. And it can mean a slightly different thing to your institution, but one thing is pretty non-negotiable, is you either know you have it or you know you don't. And so for those who know they have it, they're looking to level up and to build that capacity for the future. And for those who know that they don't, they're looking for tried and true strategies to invigorate that again. And our shift from loyalty to impact donors that we're seeing in the wider world kind of flies in the face of that. So it creates a bit of a crossroads of where we are as an industry as well.
Yeah. So why don't we jump ahead, Michelle? We'll talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry. And then from there, we'll be able to pivot and get more into, right, some of the specific components. But let's just spend the next few minutes talking about some of the trends that we see in philanthropy. So first, something that I think most people that are in at least major fundraising understand is that there is a continued compression at the bottom of the giving pyramid and upward pressure at the very top. In other words, campaigns are becoming ever more driven by a smaller and smaller group of top-end donors. That can be good and bad, right? We're not really here today to talk about that component so much as it's the reality that we're dealing with. And so we've got to be prepared to drive a small number of gifts of a very high amount that are really going to propel the great preponderance of the total dollar goal that we're about. We see that more organizations are thinking about campaigns. There's a recognition that, in short, it's the best way to raise money, right? That's the short answer of why we do campaigns. Why is that? It's because it challenges an organization to be better at everything with respect to fundraising. And again, we're going to talk about that process today, but it really does push the organization to strengthen itself in all manners. We're seeing, particularly in higher ed and even outside of higher ed, certainly within higher ed, we're seeing that the average length of campaigns tends to be in the 7 to 8 year range. We've seen some of the really big institutions go to 10. I wouldn't say that's the norm. And in fact, I've heard a lot of commentary from organizations that they feel like that's a bit too long. So most seem to be settling into this notion of something in the range of 6 to 8 years. What's notable there, and we encounter this from time to time with respect to leadership transitions, the length of campaign is greater than the average length of tenure for a president at an American university. So how do we wrestle with leadership transitions? Maybe we'll have a few minutes to talk about that today, but it's one of those interesting factors that we see from time to time, which is that leadership transitions are normal, but organizations that have planned well can persist through that relatively smoothly. And then ultimately having a sense of growth, having a growth mindset, even in an environment where talent is increasingly hard, right? In the last 24 months, we've seen people shift In some respects, it has created, I've seen some geographically remote institutions get really creative around this and see it as an opportunity to remove the requirement that their talent be based on campus and think about a nationally distributed sort of talent pool, at least for certain positions. But all in all, how can organizations move forward when really it's been the duration of our full career? There never seems to be enough talent in the pipeline to fuel these growing fundraising programs at a multitude of organizations, right? Pivoting then to a couple of other thoughts, donors themselves have new expectations. They want to have a more heightened experience overall. They want it to be impactful. They want to see ongoing value, not just from their relationship with the organization, but the impact of their giving. There's a desire, there's a new level of expectation in terms of transparency of information, to have direct involvement with their giving, right? In some cases, the implementation of their giving. That can create some challenges, but it also creates a really amazing opportunity to bring people close to the organization overall. In short, they're just desiring really meaningful, personalized interactions that allow them to have the impact that they want, right? There's a lot happening in the world, and they want to dedicate their precious time and resources to highly impactful endeavors.
That's great.
Why don't you take a few minutes, Michelle, talk about, so as we've set the stage with respect to trends, we've talked a little bit about some of the new phenomena emerging. With respect to core elements of fundamental sound campaign planning, what do you see as being some of the key components of that?
Yeah, this is what everybody showed up for today, right? This is the beginning of that magical roadmap that we all dream of at the beginning of a campaign. Realizing that there are parts that are unpredictable and that are messy, but there's so much of it that we can plan for effectively. And so this really is just a sampling of some of those key elements of a campaign. We're going to spend our time together really drilling down into several of these key areas to give you some things to think about, to really challenge how you're approaching or thinking about your systems, your processes, your people, and how you're going to go about this work. Those critical questions to get answered, they're going to set your organization or your institution up for the greatest amount of success. So we're going to start over on the left here with organizational optimization. So kind of a mouthful, but what do we mean by that? Do we have the right staff and structure in place? Do we have the right people in the right seats on the bus? Do we have vacancies in critical areas to fill? Nick talked about that kind of competition for talent right now, and how the pandemic really changed that game. How are we going to manage through that and still be competitive? Do we have the capacity to grow the team? Is that even an option? Or should we put that off to the side and think about how to do the greatest amount of work with the greatest amount of impact with what we have in place today? Do we have clumsy systems and processes that are going to trip us up? Are we prepared for increased volume of activity? If we have an onslaught of gifts come in, the best possible outcome, can we manage more? Is that going to be a challenge or a hurdle we have to overcome? Do we have the right kinds of information? Data is something we focus on and we hear a great deal about. And do we understand truly what the information we have is, what it's telling us, and how do we use it to deploy our resources based on what we do know today? As we kind of shift over to the center there, it makes a lot of sense to me that telling your philanthropic story is at the center of this graphic, because it's also the center of what we do. Moving over to that key element, we do have to source those big ideas that are going to inspire and attract the leadership donors. Campaigns are one at the top. Nick talked about that campaign pyramid is skinny. We have a colleague who is testing all of our geometry skills and calling it an obelisk these days, or a steeple. Pick your shape. But they're one at the top. And so we have to have those big ideas in place that's going to generate that kind of thinking. Yet, we also have to be able to distill those ideas down to tangible priorities and projects that actually solve problems and help us go about elevating our institution. So All that being said, we have to be able to describe it. And many of us throughout our organization have to be able to describe that impact with the rest of the world with ease and precision and clarity. So really refining the language that we use is going to set us up for success. And last but certainly not least, we have to have champions. That stakeholder engagement. Nick talked about the importance of those interviews, the importance of that buy-in. Do we have a campaign that our stakeholders, both internally and externally, we need both, do they believe in it? Do we have champions that are essential to each of these constituencies that we're going to go out and market this campaign to? As we drill into each of these things, I think this is what's probably going to spark some of our questions. So do drop those in so we can address them. Nick's going to get started talking about that first key area, that optimizing the operation. Nick, this can seem daunting, and it's often not the hero's work. So how do we make significant progress in this area without slowing ourselves down?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And it aligns actually with the first question we just had come through while you were talking a moment ago, Michelle. There was a question about having just gone through a database conversion, all the time and effort that went into that, all the processes that were changed, and how can we make sure that those processes are campaign ready. It really sets up well for this next slide, this next few minutes that we want to talk about. So when we talk about operational optimization, what we're speaking of here is how ready is the fundraising organization, the advancement division, the development division, the foundation, however you are structured. How ready are you internally, in and of yourself, to support and plan and execute and drive a major campaign? And we've, on this slide, attempted to summarize really kind of those core components. And to the point of the question that came through, systems are right at the top of that. And in fact, we see a lot of organizations jump straight to the explicit fundraising, which obviously is key. But one of the pieces, so well, Michelle, you've got to have strong underlying advancement operation systems to drive and support modern fundraising. It's becoming ever more a data-driven field, and we've got to have a system in-house that's capable of supporting that. In our case specifically, when we partner with organizations who are going through campaign planning, what we typically do, to get right to the question that was asked, what we typically do is bring one of our systems colleagues. So whereas Michelle and I have backgrounds primarily in major and principal gifts and board work and the like, we have colleagues who have exclusively spent decades in a variety of CRM platforms and will come in and observe and test and work with staff who are utilizing to really look at the workflows, the capacities. Do we have the reports that we need? Do we have the dashboards that we need? In other words, will management have the business intelligence, the analytics at hand to make real-time decisions? Will gift officers be supported reasonably well with a flow of potential new prospects? Or will they have to be spending most of their own time sourcing their own prospects, right? What level of capacity is there? And so what we really, the best organizations in the planning process really pressure test that directly. I was mentioning a moment ago analytics, and I want to spend just a moment on this point, Michelle. The field really has become ever more data-driven, and we're seeing more and more people spend time at the front end to not just refresh their wealth screening, but do various forms of modeling to think about, who among all their constituents are the most engaged, who are the most likely to give, right? That typically creates great opportunities to think about portfolio realignment. What we often find is that, during the planning process, we're able to reveal potentially lower capacity, lower engaged prospects that are in portfolios and are taking up valuable time and energy of gift officers. And likewise, there are often many relatively high capacity, highly engaged, much more likely donors who are not getting any attention, right? And so there's an opportunity there for portfolio realignment. So before we even go out and do any active fundraising, we're just asking the question, are we focusing on the right people, right? A final note there about systems, obviously, when we think about gift entry, data entry, gift acknowledgement, are those systems sound? Are they where we need them to be? Then, of course, we talk about our comprehensive fundraising programs, right, from top to bottom. And I intentionally start at the top. We typically see that for a campaign of almost any size, and this continues to fascinate me as long as I've been in the field, but it really typically comes down to whether it's a $5 million campaign or a $5 billion campaign, there are usually about 50 gifts that make the difference. And do we have the program in place to thoughtfully engage those top end folks? One of the things that's been fun for me to observe, Michelle, in the last decade, there's been some really interesting literature and research that has begun to emerge on principal gifts that, we could spend hours talking just about principal gifts, but the reality is it's more than major giving with additional zeros. It's qualitatively a deeper and more robust process. And so we have a level of experience that we can attempt to drive at a concierge level for people that are capable of these top end gifts, right? Do we have a program in place to make that happen? Major and planned gifts have been fundamental bedrocks. We won't spend a lot of time there, but how active are our gift officers? Do we have campus partners that are actively involved in that process? Do we have sufficient planned giving marketing in place, right? Comprehensively, do we have the tools in place to drive what's really going to be the middle of our gift pyramid in effect? For certain organizations, many, including higher ed, corporate and foundation giving continues to be strong in higher ed. Looking at that specifically, that's a whole different story. And it's really predicated on typically self-interest on the part of, in particularly the case of corporations, right? Or in the case of foundations who are becoming ever more intentional about their philanthropy and the impact they want to make on the world. They are looking for capable partners who can help achieve the impact on the world that they want to see, right? So all that to say, the rising significance of CFR, and then of course base giving. We continue to see for so many organizations a contraction at the bottom. In other words, a retrenchment. It's getting harder for people to see growth in donor volume, and of course that's being made up as we're talking. It's being made up for by a growth of the size of gifts at the very top end. But still, how do we ensure that the process of a campaign is all encompassing and gives everyone a chance to be involved and think about how to strengthen the annual fund? Just a few more pieces on this. Obviously, stewardship, we're not just raising money. Hopefully we're in the business of genuine lifelong relationships. That's something that's a real passion for me, is giving people a thoughtful, authentic, sincere experience as a donor. And oh, by the way, that happens to be the best way to do business and to make lifelong friends and bring people into the fold who will make multiple gifts over time, right? But do we have those functions buttoned up? Do we have a communication apparatus in place that can communicate with constituents? Again, back to universities. Do we have alumni engagement programs in place that are positioned to do more than raise money? We're seeing alumni programs get more involved with philanthropy, particularly in annual giving and in some cases planned giving. So those worlds are colliding in terms of alumni relations and development, fundraising. But writ large, when we talk about getting people involved as volunteers, getting them involved with the institution on boards, lots of other things, right? Do we have an apparatus in place capable of doing that? And then just the last point that I would make, when we look internally, do we have a culture, particularly with respect to internal partnerships and collaboration? And I'm really speaking here internally. Do we have partnerships with deans? Do we have partnerships with campus colleagues who are aware of what we're doing and are prepared to invest the time directly to play the role that we need them to play? In other words, great campaigns are not driven exclusively by the development program. They are led by the development program, but they involve a campus-wide set of leaders and individuals, right, who contribute to the process. So all in all, we're talking about here, is the organization ready internally, and has the planning process, however it's being executed, has it been set up in a way to review, examine, test all of these areas so we can make conscious decisions going into the campaign about whether or not we're in the right place on these things, and any tweaks and adjustments we might want to make.
Thanks for that, Nick. We did have one question come in just a couple of minutes ago. And so I think I've got the context on this right, but if I don't, I would ask that attendee to clarify certainly. But asking about if this is what a feasibility study would be considered, or is that something different? So maybe this is just an opportunity to clarify some language, Nick, on feasibility and planning and kind of how would you encourage folks to think about those things and use those terms?
You know, I'm so glad this question came through. We didn't overtly plan for this, but to a degree, it's semantics, but it also has great strategic relevance. And so the short answer is we used to call this a feasibility study, as it were. What we see is that language is starting to sunset, and we're using the terminology campaign planning because of a couple of things. One, most institutions are capable today of some kind of campaign, but the question is, are they ready right now for their best campaign? Or do they need to implement new practices, changes, acquire new tools, grow the team? What is needed inherently to execute the best possible campaign? And so we think of the planning process as being comprehensive, as we're articulating here today. To the feasibility component with respect to interviews, we still see most organizations doing a core set of feasibility interviews, but we sort of think of campaign planning in short as a feasibility study, as it were, on steroids, really testing, is the organization ready for its best possible campaign, and how. That's really the question, right? And how. We'll talk about that at the end. But how can planning, if done well, put the organization in position to make specific adjustments and adaptations for the best possible campaign?
Yeah, and thanks for that explanation, Nick. It's something that we talk about internally quite a bit, and so it was a great and very relevant question. We did have another comment that cleared everything up, so we answered the question. Somebody also requested that we send out maybe some reading material or some articles on effective and best-in-class principle giving, and we can certainly take a look at some things that we can send out as a follow-up. So thank you so much for that suggestion.
No doubt.
Let's see. We're gonna
so why don't
bounce
we
on to
pivot,
the next.
talk a little bit about the philanthropic story, just to kind of set you up, Michelle. So assuming that the organization is ready internally to drive operationally the fundamentals of a campaign, when we start to think about what are the tools in the tool chest that we need, it really begins with the story, right? Another terminology we often use is case. So why don't you spend the next few minutes talking a little bit more about the philanthropic story?
Yeah, and because I do know a few of the folks who are on the call today, those of you who are sitting and diligently listening in your offices, you'll smile when you see me smile about this topic, because it's one of my favorites. Storytelling is such an important part of what we do, and so these next couple of slides, I hope, get you thinking and testing your thinking a little bit on case development. So the crux of this topic is really about defining and designing priorities, knowing your what and your why and your when, because that's what drives that sense of urgency that a campaign does us the big favor of offering. So it comes down to big ideas drive big gifts. And that may seem like a simple statement, but we know that donors do see solutions. And they're looking for solutions. They're not necessarily looking to cross something off a list of needs that we may or may not think that we have. And complex solutions, they really start with collaboration. Nick talked about that importance of collaboration internally on campus with our partners for higher education folks, with your academic leadership. Those are moving beyond the needs, the invoices that are piling up of projects we want to address. This is talking about creating, co-creating, doing, changing, being. And it takes a little different kind of thinking to be able to approach it that way. And now, if you're a statistics person and you want some numbers to go along with that, I just want to share a quick set of stats with you. So from 2018 to 2020, which we will all acknowledge was an interesting time pretty much pre-pandemic, and then into the pandemic, there were still 67 gifts of $50 million plus to higher education in the US. Those gifts were almost $9 billion. They went to 28 public institutions. 20 of those gifts were multidisciplinary, and half of the 8 largest gifts were also multidisciplinary. So it really goes to show that when we can come together across the institution, talk about how we as the institution or the organization are positioned to change the world, it makes a difference to those leadership donors. So we're going to talk about this funnel a little bit. And what I like about this visual is it's a very visual representation of what I'm going to call the thinking funnel that can help us elevate and position our case and our campaign priorities. You're much more likely to inspire those donors if you can move them with a persuasive case that is informed by facts, infused by emotions, and it describes a way forward. And going through this funnel of questions helps us get there and make sure that we're not shortcutting ourselves, because really that's going to deposition us with donors of being able to talk about larger gifts. So if we start at the very top of that funnel, it's easier. We can work our way from the biggest, broadest questions down to a very specific priority. You may not always have the opportunity to start at the top of this funnel. But taking a specific project or an idea, which kind of might live in the middle, and rising it back up to that very widest part of the funnel is a great way to test a priority. It answers the question of relevance. Why do we matter? And it's important to someone who's looking to make an important, sometimes transformational gift. They're not, again, just looking to solve the problem, but to create something, perhaps a legacy. This progression of thinking and questioning, it's going to help you convey a bolder vision and in turn a better future. The product will inspire donors to get caught up in that vision. They start to see themselves as part of the solution. And when we are standing next to each other and planning together, that donor, that investor, that prospect can even elevate our thinking beyond what the institution is planning. They understand that their support is the bridge. For many, especially our public institutions, there are other funding sources, and though they may be shrinking, this growing piece of the pie is philanthropy, and those who are supporting it understand that. Nick, if you want to hit the next slide here, we'll talk about that intersection. Because we do know that there are lots of things that we'd like to see in our organizations and at our institutions that are priorities and they're important, but they're not going to make it through the funnel. We know that there are critical and legitimate priorities that we will have to find a way to address somehow, but they are just not that exciting to a donor, and they don't match their dreams for the future or their dreams for the institution that means so much to them, or the impact they want to have on the world. Projects may very well be well-defined and they are important. They have big consequences, but they just don't elicit that investor's interest. So we want to focus on that sweet spot. We have to test that thinking for programs and projects that are of legitimate interest to prospects. And there's a couple of ways that we can go about doing that. So if you're on campus or in your organization or your nonprofit, and there are things that are making their way onto the list that don't have a natural constituency, that's a red flag. If we don't already have someone in mind that could be a lead donor or a lead champion or help us build that constituency, that can be a red flag. So as you're thinking about those priorities and the legitimacy of those priorities, really test your thinking to set yourself up for the greatest amount of success. The bigger and broader those areas of impact are going to be, the greater chance of success you stand to have at the tip top of your pyramid, where those campaigns are won. So Nick's going to take us through kind of the next important step in that campaign planning. When we get buy-in, when we get those champions, we make our new best friends who believe in what we are up to. So Nick, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Thanks, Michelle. While you were talking, we had a couple of great questions come in.
Sure.
That are on a couple of different topics. So why don't we take a few minutes now and get into a couple of those.
You bet.
So one great one that came from John Smith is, would an institution be better served to establish a culture of philanthropy across the institution first and then step into a campaign, or can both be accomplished at the same time? And Michelle, you may have thoughts on this. You know, my thinking is it depends. And I mean that sincerely. And the reason I mean that is, it depends to what level there is an absence of quality philanthropic culture and philanthropic operational components. There are organizations that are flatly not ready, period, to stand up a campaign, in which case they absolutely need to work on their ongoing case, right? Not a campaign case, but just their case for fundraising, period, on a year-over-year basis, on their processes, on gift officers doing the right things, on having a base level of reports and so on, right? Conversely, I have seen organizations, typically mid-size organizations, that have some optimizing to do, but who look at a campaign as a chance, frankly, as a reason to get better at everything as it relates to philanthropy. And in that case, I have seen it executed well, where they make a calculated, intentional decision to move into the leadership phase, what used to be thought of as the quiet phase, recognizing they were pushing offshore while the ship was still being built, as it were. But they knew that, and they had board alignment on that notion, and they wanted to use the healthy pressure of a campaign to strengthen the program, and I've seen that done. I've seen that done fairly well. Any thoughts you would add on that question, Michelle, before we move ahead to another one?
Yeah, I really do think it is dependent on what you are experiencing in your organization or your institution today. But what I would offer is that a campaign is a very exciting time that can really rally internal feelings and rally people around positive feelings about the institution. There is something really galvanizing about taking on a big, hairy, audacious goal together. So you have an opportunity to think about that a couple of different ways. Certainly, I would encourage you to have as much buy-in before you take off the launch pad. But there are also, you're gonna see that strengthen over time with success, and each time you get to celebrate around those milestones. So it might not be an either or first or second, but more about really coming together around those moments and being able to build your internal and external culture sort of simultaneously.
Yep. Quickly pivoting to another question that I saw that came in about, how does all of this apply to healthcare? You know, we've spent a lot of time using a higher ed paradigm, and the short version for me is it applies very much, almost directly. I spent 2 years in my career leading a small hospital foundation. My experience was with our colleagues within the firm who really specialize in health science. One of the things that I see is that there might be a slight leaning toward facility-related campaigns. It's often about the next wing at the hospital, or a new facility that will enable a new service to be delivered. So when we think about the underlying components of philanthropy, for example, very much the same. We talk about systems and operations, gift acknowledgement, research, stewardship, portfolios, gift officers. It's effectively a direct one-to-one, right? Constituent engagement is a little bit different. Sourcing, prospecting, the healthcare organizations that have successfully deployed a grateful patient model, that's a very different model of prospecting and engagement than an alumni model. So that's certainly a point of difference, where healthcare organizations want to think about, do they have the systems in place to execute that well, right? And often it's a physician, it's a department chair at the hospital who is the equivalent of a dean, as it were, and can really be directly involved partnering with gift officers. And so short version is, from my perspective, it's very, very relatable and very similar with just, some key differentiators. Why don't we jump ahead, Michelle? We've got about 15 minutes left, a little bit of content to get through, and then hopefully we can get through as many of our questions as well. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Perfect.
So to your point a moment ago, when we start to really think about not just do we have the internal operations to support and drive a campaign, as we've talked about, do we have the right story, the right case for support? Are we utilizing the planning process to very intentionally build stakeholder engagement? And frankly, this would be a piece that is probably the greatest risk of jumping over. I saw a question come in earlier about convincing leadership on the value of investing in campaign planning, however that goes. This is probably really one of those areas where it comes down, because I'll be blunt for a second, intentionally, to make a point. Assuming that an organization has some reasonable data at hand about its recent history, and so you've got a little bit of data to go off of in terms of your trends. You've got a little bit of a sense of your staffing and what kind of yield you're getting per gift officer and things like that. You could probably jot down on a napkin in a crude manner what a rough construct mathematically for a campaign. But did that process build any buy-in from anybody outside of the development shop? I think that's really what we're talking about here, right? And so when we think about that stakeholder engagement, I think about two groups in particular, and there may well be more, but I think of two. The first being internal to the organization. As we were talking about earlier, is there clarity around case and priorities? Is there agreement? This may be an area where you would probably see similarities and differences to our question a moment ago about higher ed and healthcare. Higher ed is renowned throughout the entirety of its history for shared governance, right? Which means everybody gets an idea and an opinion. And so it can be difficult to coalesce these varied ideas into a streamlined set of needs and priorities, right? But can we get on the same page? Can we coalesce these ideas into a set of buckets, maybe, or even a singular project or initiative? Ideally, that's where we want to get to, so that we have organizational leadership in alignment with what we are fundraising for, right? But then further, do they have those active partnerships? Are they directly involved in the cultivation and solicitation of prospects? And if they're not, if we haven't set in place operating practices where those individuals are regularly part of the donor engagement process, how can we achieve that? Is there a need for training? Is there a need for just new business plans and structures to be put in place, right? But all in all, how can we get internal organizational, institutional leadership on the same page with respect to what we are fundraising for, what our goals and aspirations are, and how that work will be done, right? The other key piece, obviously, is this amazing group external to the organization. It begins, and I've intentionally noted it here, in my mind, it begins with board leadership. Great board leadership is helping to cast the direction for the institution strategically. Where are we trying to go? What are we trying to accomplish? How are we differentiating ourselves in a challenging, crowded marketplace? Beyond that, how are they involved themselves directly? And so how do we involve board members? And beyond that, lead donors, potential volunteers, campaign volunteers. How are we involving them directly in the campaign planning process, as we talked about before, to help build buy-in around the case, buy-in for the need to do a campaign now, to raise a certain amount of money, to achieve certain outcomes for the organization, right? All to hopefully warm them, bring them close at hand, so that when the decision is made institutionally to go forward with a campaign, they're ready to fulfill, they're excited to fulfill their role of being a lead donor, a champion, and help be a connector as well, right? Help open doors, help with prospecting, help with cultivation, and even solicitation for those that are comfortable with it. We talked earlier about the value of donor interviews, and we're really seeking there to get the perspective on, do they think that the case we are putting together is the right story now? Further, do they have confidence in organizational leadership to drive forward? Do they have confidence in the readiness of the development program? This is an interesting one, right? They don't spend time day to day doing what we do. They don't understand fundraising from a professional standpoint typically, but nonetheless, on a gut check level, do they have confidence in the people in advancement to drive and support a campaign? And so all in all, the planning process, in our experience, when done well, is a time when both of these audiences can really be engaged actively to play the roles that they need to ultimately. So really what we're saying is, in a lot of ways here, Michelle, I feel like if the planning process is executed properly, it is optimally setting up success in the actual campaign. It's not just about saying what is a dollar goal that we can attain and over what time period, but strategically, how can we get there and how can we engage the necessary parties to do what they need to do, right?
Because the goals will not get smaller in the future.
They
So
won't.
planning for a longer runway is in our best interest as practitioners.
Absolutely.
Nick, we did have a great question come in here
Sure.
from Diane Tracy. Any thoughts about timing and ask soon for lead campaign gifts with rising inflation, a declining stock market, the Russian-Ukrainian war, and continued uncertainty around COVID? It would seem it's I believe she calls it the perfect storm here. Should we wait it out a bit? Do you want to take a first stab and then I can jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And when we, again, this hour is about campaign planning writ large. Some of the examples we're offering are from how we do it specifically, but we hope that this session is about a lot more than that. One of the things we always take a look at are those external factors, including many of the things that she mentioned, right? The economy, geopolitical phenomena happening around the world and the like, right? So the short answer is we're wise to look at those things. When we look longitudinally over the course of decades, gross philanthropy in America used to trend really closely with GDP. That is changing, and it's now starting to trend more aligned with the stock market. Why is that? It's probably because we're seeing the bulk of philanthropy come from fewer people who are heavily invested in the market, and their either mindset or their actual giving capacity is influenced by what's happening in the market. So that's a trend that we're seeing, is that giving overall is becoming linked a little bit more to the market as opposed to broad GDP. That said, we still see, and this most recently, it was a very acute example for us the last 24 to 36 months. COVID, not surprisingly, gave a lot of people pause. And there were a lot of organizations that weren't sure what to do, how to react. What we have seen from our perspective in this business over decades is that philanthropy persists over time successfully through essentially all phenomena, all environments. There will be notable adjustments. There might be a modest pullback in giving during a recession. That's very real. What's key to note is giving doesn't fall off the table. It tends to be a marginal retrenchment as opposed to a dramatic retrenchment. That's a long way of saying what we see is organizations that thoughtfully stay at it are better positioned. And so, for instance, during COVID, one of the things we found is that donors continued to give rather generously, and people who did not pause their engagement of potential prospects nor pause their internal capacity building were best situated when things came out. I want to be really clear, there are some key ways you can hedge around that or be nuanced, right? It could well be that you stay in a leadership phase longer until there's more stability in the world, economically or otherwise, right? It could be that we're having extra careful conversations with individual donors one by one about how their life is being affected, how their resources, their portfolio is being affected, right? But altogether, that I guess is to say that we see most organizations who stay at it, but in a very thoughtful, careful way, having the most success and being well positioned when things stabilize and recover.
Yeah, Nick, the only thing I would add to that, and I think that's just it's a great explanation of how to approach kind of that sticky subject, is that's really something that you have to think about. How can I address that in my strategic cultivation of that individual donor? How do I start to dispel some of those things without providing unnecessary excuses or barriers to giving? But how do I address some of those things in my permission seeking stage of that late season cultivation right before that solicitation to ease those concerns? So I'm not surprising anyone or catching them at a moment of vulnerability, but instead we're on this journey together. So I think that's something that you need to understand in your relationship and your work with the donor, to identify what are those barriers, if there are any, and there might not be.
Yeah. So we're pretty much right on track here. I think we'll be able to kind of conclude our prepared content, Michelle, answer remaining questions in the last couple of minutes that we have. I hope that we have appropriately set the stage here, that if and when done well, campaign planning can help construct a roadmap for how to launch and execute the best possible campaign. So it certainly includes goals and timelines, which are the major predominant questions that people want answered. But it also helps provide valuable feedback, particularly through donor interviews, through campus discussions about, do we have the right case for support now? Is it compelling? Are we telling the story in the right way about what our impact is on the world? Why is the world a better place? Because we exist and we do what we do. Do we have, as we've talked about already a lot, do we have the systems in place operationally? If not, how can we strengthen how we do data analytics? How can we strengthen the reports we have to give management the dashboards they need to see progress at the portfolio level, at the staff level, at the aggregated department level, and so on, right? How do we put plans in place to strengthen all of those elements? Fundraising, obviously, as we've talked, how can we strengthen all the way up the chain vertically, from base gifts to principal gifts and gifts of a lifetime? How do we strengthen operationally our components within that? Thinking about optimizing portfolios. This is a common component, right? If done well, the planning process can reveal opportunities to make sure that our gift officers are targeting the right people. Really bringing it home in terms of thinking about principal gifts. Are we focused on those top 25 to 50 overall prospects? And if we've interviewed the right people during the interview process, what insight can we gain onto how exactly to engage them? And then, as we've talked a lot, do we have the board in the right mind space? And are we positioned to involve the right people so as to quickly assemble a healthy volunteer structure with the right people coming out? I think we're right about time, Michelle. Do you have any other thoughts, questions, ideas you would add?
I just saw one more pop into the chat, and I thought maybe it was a question, but instead it was a compliment. So we'll take that. Thank you very much for that, Jenna. This has been a lot of fun, and I do hope that you all walked away with maybe a little different way to think about this and your approach to this, but certainly also some real tangible things that can be applied on Monday, so to speak. But this has been a great session. We appreciate your participation and the great questions that come in. And we're going to be following up with some things as well.
Michelle, this has been fun. We should do this again sometime. I hope you have a great holiday weekend. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. I've got some friends and colleagues, a couple of clients. It's great to see some familiar names and a lot that I don't know. I hope we've added something valuable today to the conversation out there on campaign. So great to be with everyone. Michelle, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, you too, Nick. Take care.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.